Hello friends, welcome back to Biotech Simplified. Today we will discuss about the difference between homozygous and heterozygous. So let us start from the basics, that is the definition of homozygous as well as heterozygous. So both homozygous as well as heterozygous is a genetic condition. So both homozygous as well as heterozygous is a genetic condition. So what is the difference between homozygous and heterozygous? In the case of homozygous, an individual inherits same allele of a gene from both the parents. Whereas in the case of heterozygous, an individual inherits different alleles of a gene from the two parents. So, if an individual inherits same allele of a gene, that is, a gene has two alleles. So the two alleles which is inherited by an individual, if it is same, then it is homozygous, and if it is different, it is heterozygous. So this is the basic difference between homozygous and heterozygous. So homozygous, it has same allele of a gene, whereas in the case of heterozygous, it has different allele of a gene. If the two allele of a gene, so it is of the same type, then it is homozygous, and if the alleles of a gene are of different types, then it is heterozygous. So let us take an example and explain you what is homozygous and what is heterozygous. So consider this chromosome, that is, this is from dad, that is, and this chromosome is from mother. So this is dad's and this is mom's chromosome. So a gene has two or more alleles. So if a gene that is responsible for the blood type, okay, for example, we are taking a blood type, and the gene that is responsible for a blood type, suppose it has two alleles. So from the dad, that is the allele from the dad, if it is similar to the allele that is coming from the mother, then it is that is homozygous. Whereas if the allele that comes from the father is different from the allele that comes from the mother, then it is that is heterozygous. So if the alleles are similar, then it is homozygous, and if the allele is different, then it is heterozygous. So now let us come to the second difference between homozygous and heterozygous. So in the case of homozygous, there are two varieties, that is homozygous dominant as well as homozygous recessive. So when we represent a genotype of a homozygous dominant, we represent it as capital A and capital A. So if it is a homozygous recessive, then we represent it as small a and small a. That is, if it is dominant, we represent it as capital A and capital A, whereas if it is recessive, we represent it as small a and small a. But in the case of heterozygous, there is only one type of genotype, that is capital A and small a. Why is it? Because both the allele in the case of heterozygous is different. So since it is different, only one type of heterozygous is present. Whereas in the case of homozygous, there are two varieties, that is homozygous dominant and homozygous recessive. As we discussed in the earlier slide, homozygous is of two varieties, that is homozygous dominant and homozygous recessive. So suppose if it is a hair color and the gene is represented by B. So if the allele that is the both allele which comes from father as well as mother, if both are in dominant form. So in genetics we represent dominant as capital letters and recessive as small letters. So if both the alleles are in the dominant form, then it is homozygous dominant, whereas when it is in the recessive form, we represent it as, or we call it as homozygous recessive form. So next, let us discuss based on the phenotypes. That is, for homologous conditions, there are two phenotypes. Since there are two types of homologous conditions, that is dominant homologous as well as recessive homologous. So there are two phenotypes, that is one is dominant and the second one is recessive. So when we take heterozygous condition to account, we know that there are two alleles. So one allele is in the dominant form and the next allele is in the recessive form. So the phenotype of heterozygous condition is due to the dominant allele. So in homozygous condition, it is dominant or recessive form. So the phenotype is dominant or due to recessive form. Whereas in the case of heterozygous condition, the phenotype is generally due to the dominant allele. Now let us explain phenotype by using an example of color of a bird. So as we discussed earlier too, we know that homozygous is of two types, that is dominant and recessive. So since there are two types of homozygous, these phenotype, that is the phenotype of homozygous, is either due to the dominant allele or due to the recessive allele. So we know that in the case of dominant, if it is dominant homozygous, both the alleles are of dominant form and the color of the bird is due to the dominant allele. So if it is homozygous recessive, we know that the allele is in recessive form. Hence, the color of the bird is due to the recessive allele. So, a homozygous can have two phenotypes, that is, one due to the dominant allele and the second due to the recessive allele. But in the case of heterozygous, the phenotype of heterozygous is always due to the dominant allele. So, we know that here we can see that the bird color is red, and it is red because the dominant allele codes for red. So we can say that in the case of heterozygous, there is only one phenotype, that is the phenotype of the dominant allele. Whereas in the case of homozygous, there are two phenotypes, that is one due to the dominant allele and the second due to the recessive allele. Now let us discuss based on the genotype. That is, in the case of homozygous, the genotype is due to a single type of gamete, where in the case of heterozygous, the genotype is a result of two different gametes. So let us take this diagram to explain the genotype of a homozygous as well as a heterozygous condition. So in a homozygous condition, which is of capital B and capital B, it has a single type of gamete, that is capital B. Whereas in the case of heterozygous condition, that is capital B small b, it has two different types of gametes, that is capital B as well as small b. So we can say that in the case of homozygous, the genotype is of a single type of gamete, whereas in the case of heterozygous, the genotype is due to two different types of gametes. So now let us discuss the types of homozygous as well as heterozygous condition. So homozygous condition has two types, as we discussed earlier too. There are two types, that is homozygous dominant and homozygous recessive. Whereas in the case of heterozygous condition, there are three different forms, that is codominance, incomplete dominance as well as complete dominance. So organisms or cells with homozygous condition are known as homozygotes, whereas the organisms or cells which has the heterozygous condition is known as heterozygotes. So these homozygous condition is observed in animals that are reproduced by asexual means, whereas the heterozygous condition is seen in the animals which are produced by sexual means. That is, homozygous is seen in asexual reproduction, whereas heterozygous is observed in the case of sexual reproduction. I hope the difference between homozygous as well as heterozygous condition is very clear. For more such videos, do subscribe to our channel by Tech Simplified. If you like the channel, please like and share with your friends.